Parce que la crise actuelle comporte sa part de défis, mais aussi d'opportunités. Parce que les règles du jeu du commerce extérieur sont appelées à se transformer. Parce que les exportations québécoises représentent près de la moitié de notre PIB et parce que les entreprises d'ici doivent faire preuve d'agilité et de résilience pour assurer la relance et repenser l'après. La Fédération des chambres de commerce du Québec et BMO présente la nouvelle série de rencontres virtuelles 360 COREX. Invités réputés, thématiques d'actualité et solutions concrètes pour aborder cette nouvelle réalité. Une réflexion à 360 degrés pour faire le tour de la question. Les rencontres virtuelles 360 COREX, ensemble pour propulser la relance.
Excellent. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous. Donc, je me présente, Charles Milliard, PDG de la Fédération des chambres de commerce du Québec. Je vous remercie de nous avoir choisis ce midi. On attend un nombre record de personnes donc sur la ligne pour notre webinaire aujourd'hui. Je pense que la qualité de notre panel ce midi y est pour quelque chose. Comme vous le savez, donc, on organise des webinaires pour favoriser les corridors d'exportation, donc principalement aux États-Unis. Et aujourd'hui, on se retrouve donc le 3 septembre, donc à 60 jours déjà de l'échéance électorale américaine. On a déjà vu les conventions républicaines et démocrates au cours des dernières semaines. Donc aujourd'hui, on veut se pencher avec nos trois panélistes sur les conséquences politiques, économiques et commerciales donc de cette élection-là. La participation au programme COREX, c'est toujours un effort d'équipe avec l'ensemble de notre réseau de chambres de commerce partout au Québec. Alors, je vais prendre le temps de remercier les chambres qui nous ont aidés à populer le webinaire de ce midi. Donc, je vais juste m'assurer, je pense qu'on entend tous un peu un petit... voilà, parfait. Alors, écoutez, je remercie donc l'Alliance des chambres de commerce de Chaudière-Appalaches, de la région de la Naudière, de la Chambre de commerce de la Baie des Chaleurs, Gatineau, la MRC de Rivière-du-Loup, Saint-Georges-de-Beauce, les Bois-Francs érables, Rive-Sud, la Chambre de commerce et d'industrie de Québec, du Saint-Jérôme métropolitain, du Haut-Richelieu, de la vallée du Richelieu, de Sherbrooke, de Kamouraska-Lillet et finalement le regroupement des chambres donc, du Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. Je prends la peine de le nommer pour qu'on puisse comprendre qu'il y a vraiment l'ensemble du Québec qui est représenté sur la ligne aujourd'hui. So, to our panelists, we have people from all over Quebec, all regions of Quebec are represented in this webinar. So, again, thank you for being with us. I'm just going to present our speakers for today, and then I'll hand it over to notre animateur. Donc, premièrement, M. Raymond Chrétien, donc conseiller stratégique chez Fasken, évidemment aussi ancien ambassadeur du Canada aux États-Unis. M. Chrétien a aussi été négociateur en chef du gouvernement du Québec dans des dossiers qui sont encore d'actualité, dans le dossier du bois d'œuvre, du papier non couché à base de pâte thermomécanique, de l'acier, d'aluminium. M. Chrétien aussi a été ambassadeur, comme tout le monde le sait, dans d'autres pays, en France, en Belgique, au Mexique, au Congo. Alors, ma foi, une expérience assez exceptionnelle en termes de diplomatie canadienne. Alors, merci, M. Chrétien, d'être avec nous. We also have Mr. David Jacobson, Vice Chair, BMO Financial Group. You're based in Chicago, Illinois. Very pleased to have you with us today. And of course, you were the 22nd United States Ambassador to Canada from 2009 to 2013. You've also served in the Obama White House a couple of years ago as Special Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel. So thank you for being with us. Et notre dernier invité, ma foi, se passe de présentation, mais allons-y quand même. John Parizella, conseiller spécial, stratégie et rayonnement au cabinet de relations publiques nationales. Une expérience politique médiatique qui est reconnue partout au Québec, au Canada et même à l'extérieur. Alors, John a accepté de conduire cette entrevue avec nos deux distingués invités. Alors, je vais laisser la parole à John. On reviendra vers la fin de la rencontre qui se terminera à 13h15 avec une période de questions. Je vous invite déjà à lever la main virtuellement. Et vous pourrez évidemment poser vos questions en français ou en anglais. And we'll make sure to translate the questions if they're asked in French. Alors, merci beaucoup à tous d'être là. John, je te cède la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Tu es bien gentil, Charles. Merci beaucoup à la Fédération des chambres de commerce du Québec. Je vous avoue que la période de confinement m'a permis de visiter le Québec peut-être plus que je fais d'habitude durant la période estivale. Et donc, quand tu mentionnais les noms des chambres de commerce, c'est sûr que ça faisait chaud au cœur parce que Québec, ça vaut la peine d'être vécu. Malheureusement, ça a pris une pandémie pour que les gens l'apprécient davantage. Je pense que tu as mis très bien la table. Nos deux conférenciers, c'est des gens de grande marque. Je connais Raymond depuis très longtemps et le fait qu'il était ambassadeur dans 4 différents pays, dont les États-Unis, à un moment très crucial. Et David est pour moi une personne que j'ai connue au départ quand il a été nommé par M. Obama. Full disclosure, I've always been a fan of Barack Obama, so I must say it openly. And I think David saw a little sign that showed that 2008 I was actually doing door to door in New Hampshire and in Virginia. So, but we put the full disclosure aside right now. And I will conduct this conversation because I really consider it a conversation in English. And again, as Charles a si bien dit, les questions, sentez-vous bien à l'aise de poser en français ou en anglais. Je vais quand même répéter un peu ce que Charles a dit concernant la matière qui va faire partie de notre conversation. Nous allons parler des relations Canada-US. Et certains, Charles a mentionné tantôt, avant de venir en scène, que j'avais une photo de John F. Kennedy à côté. Et c'est un petit peu approprié parce que John F. Kennedy est venu parler au Parlement canadien en 1962. Puis il a dit que l'économie faisait du Québec et du Canada et des États-Unis les grands partenaires. L'histoire nous a unifiés parce qu'on a fait des guerres ensemble. On a aussi, on partage une frontière, on partage des valeurs, on partage la géographie essentiellement. Et si M. Kennedy vivait aujourd'hui, il verrait à quel point que le Canada et les États-Unis se sont davantage coordonnés, travaillés ensemble. Ça n'a pas une connotation démocrate ou républicain, libéral ou conservateur ou NPD ou whatever. Ça a une connotation que nous sommes les meilleurs amis, le meilleur partenariat sur la Terre est entre le Canada et les États-Unis, même si ce n'est pas parfait. So I think for those of you who are following from different parts of Canada, you'll probably see John F. Kennedy's picture in the back. But John F. Kennedy did say that we were the best partners on the face of the earth for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was economic, historical, circumstance. We fought in wars together, and of course our geography. So without further ado, I will ask Ambassador David, David Jacobs, I will occasionally call him David because I consider him a friend.
That's just fine.
But, you know, he is a very well-respected lawyer before he went into politics. And then, of course, before he went into diplomacy, and then now is working in the private sector with a terrific organization called the BMO. So I will ask him to tell us a little bit about his, as we saw en français, son passage au Canada comme ambassadeur, how it was. And then I'll ask my dear friend Raymond to continue afterwards.
Well, first of all, it is a delight to be on this panel with John and Raymond, two very good friends of mine from my days in Canada. You know, the question of what it was like, as I always tell folks, if the president ever asks you if you want to be the United States ambassador to Canada, say yes. It was an extraordinary experience. To tell you the truth, when I first got there, I really didn't understand as much as I would have liked to about Canada. The best evidence of that is on the first day that I was there, I said that in the first 2 months that I was in Canada, I was going to visit all 10 provinces. Sounded easy. Actually, the first place I went was Quebec. But I took trains, I took boats, I took planes, I took cars. And actually, on exactly the last day, I made it to PEI. But it's a big country full of wonderful people. I have been very fortunate in my life. John mentioned some of it, but I have had more than my share of good fortune. But with the possible exception of getting married and the birth of my children, the greatest good fortune I ever had was the time I spent in Canada. My one story that I think illustrates this a little bit, Barack Obama came to Canada, came there a number of times while I was there, but I believe it was the first time, and he's getting off Air Force One and all the pomp and circumstance and bands playing and stuff. And he comes down the stairway and he says to me, "So how's it going?" And I said, "Mr. President, I have the best job in the United States government." And he paused for a moment. He looked at me. He said, "You want to trade?" And I think we both thought that I had a particularly great job. So it was a great time. I go back regularly, at least when the borders open. I still have lots of good friends in Canada, including John and Ramon, and probably a number of people out there in the Zoomosphere.
Well, thank you very much. It's, I must reciprocate by saying that people really loved having you as ambassador. You took a liking to Canada. It became a love affair, ultimately. So, you know, David, we miss you, but we're happy to see that we're still in your heart, and hopefully we'll be in your visiting plans in the months ahead. Raymond Chrétien est une personne que je me cache pas de dire, je crois, il aime pas ça quand je le dis, mais c'est pour moi le plus grand diplomate, peut-être avec la possible exception de Lester B. Pearson. Donc pour moi, j'ai le plus haute estime pour Raymond. Et Raymond a été ambassadeur à une période excessivement importante dans l'histoire Canada-US. Il a été là à travers l'administration Clinton. Il a été près de 7 ans, je pense qu'il est rentré dans sa 7e année. Donc, j'aimerais ça que Raymond nous parle plus en termes de la relation comme telle, Canada-US, et l'importance que ça joue encore aujourd'hui, puis surtout dans 2 mois, quand on va avoir 2 mois, jour pour jour, on va savoir qui va être, on pense, élu comme président des États-Unis. So I will ask Raymond to give us an overall view of life as the Canadian ambassador to the United States and how he thinks things have actually evolved since. We are 2 months away from Election Day in the United States, so there will be either the same or a new president. So it becomes very, very relevant that we have the point of view of an experienced diplomat like Raymond. Raymond, je vous cède la parole. It's your word. Your words.
Merci beaucoup, John. D'abord, je désire remercier la Fédération des chambres de commerce du Québec pour cette aimable invitation. Je suis très heureux de partager cette plateforme avec John, bien sûr, mon collègue et ami, avec David Jacobson, qui a bien représenté son pays à Ottawa pendant quelques années. John m'a donné 7-8 minutes, en fait, pour parler de l'essentiel, l'essence de la relation entre nos 2 pays. Je vais le faire de la façon suivante. Quelques mots sur l'état actuel de la relation. Ensuite, quels sont les grands enjeux? What are the big issues that we're facing right now? And in the third place, where it's going. First, I think that the relationship now between our 2 countries works reasonably well, but it is far more tense than it was under Obama or even under President Clinton when I was there more than 25 years ago. It has been more tense essentially because of the difficult and arduous renegotiation of NAFTA, now the USMCA. And also, it's not very pleasant to see our leaders being insulted regularly by members of the administration. So it's working, it's tense. And then we'll come back later on about the future. Now, what are the key issues facing the relationship? I would like to put 5 on the table. The first is, of course, the implementation of the new USMCA. It came into effect the 1st of July. At the end of this month, all the final regulations that have been drafted, it'll be fully into force. This is a huge accomplishment by the 3 countries concerned, Canada, Mexico, and the US. that will bring stability and certainty to the markets. The second issue, of course, is related to the first, is protectionism. Protectionism is there all over the place, and it's likely to be there for quite some time. President Trump came into power saying America first, and he has certainly respected that. The ink was not even dry. It's not even dry on the USMCA that we have seen new tariffs imposed on aluminum. A couple of years ago, it was steel, 25%, 10% aluminum. Now it's again aluminum. We have to fight those protectionist measures all the time. We'll come back to this because it deserves a better discussion, especially for businessmen who are listening to this discussion. The third is the border. The border, you know, it's huge. It's about 240 points of transport, of links between our two countries. It used to be totally demilitarized. Now it's far more militarized than it used to be. It's closed until the 23rd of September. Likely to be closed longer because there's a perception in Canada that until the pandemic is more under control, we should limit access to Americans to Canada. So but it's working. I must say I was pleasantly surprised to see that our two countries, in 3 or 4 days, were able to decide on how to close this very complex border. It was done, good cooperation between the two countries. Very interesting, at the moment, there's about only 8% of people, non-essential, crossing that border. I'm talking about individuals. And the reduction of about 30% in the traffic of trucking. So it means that really, it is not what it used to be before the pandemic. And it's likely to remain like that because the two countries are in recession and there are bound to be some effects at the border. Also, two countries have worked well for the repatriation of both Canadians and millions of them on both sides of the border. Good cooperation there. Good cooperation on the issue of the pandemic. There was a bit of hiccups at the beginning. It was a company that was reluctant, was prevented from exporting what it had promised to do. But since then, Canada's provided for billions of dollars of equipment at the beginning. As our nurses from Windsor have kept visiting Detroit. So good cooperation there. The fourth issue, and I think it's not directly linked to the Canada-US relationship, but it's the extradition request by the US to get Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, presently in Vancouver, going through her trial. This request by the US has thrown a real wrench in our own relationship with China, and I think it deserves a discussion later on as well. The final point, I'll just mention it, maybe it'll be of little interest, but it's the foreign policy of the US. President Trump came into power saying l'isolationnisme, as we say in French. I mean, let's get out of Afghanistan, let's get out of the Middle East, let's get out of a lot of international organizations, and it has had an impact on Canada's foreign policy. So these are the fifth issue. This is the fifth issue that I think we should discuss today. Finally, where it's going, I will just limit my comments to the next 60 days. The next 60 days, all diplomats from all countries of the world, certainly it's true in Ottawa, have to keep a low profile, have to be very careful not to take a side into the political equation. It's up to the American people to decide who's going to be their president. So no word or no gesture that could make an already difficult relationship even worse. I'll stop here for the moment.
Yeah, John, if I could add just one thing to Ramon's comments, which I agree with, about the high level, the state of the relationship. And you alluded to it in your opening remarks, but some of the people on this Zoom may have visited the United States Embassy in Ottawa. And in that embassy, literally carved into the granite wall, is the quote that you referred to. It was a speech that President Kennedy gave to the House of Commons in Ottawa. And what he said, and actually wrote it down, was that geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. Those whom God has so joined, let no man put asunder. And I believe, despite issues that existed in my day, and quite frankly, worse issues or more complicated issues today, that those are eternal truths. Obviously, President Trump has put some of those to challenge, but I believe that fundamentally there is a relationship between the Canadian people and the American people. And again, something that happened to me over and over while I was in Canada, I would travel around the country, and I did a lot of that, not just for the first 2 months. And I cannot tell you how many times somebody would take me aside wherever I happen to be. They'd put their arm around me and they'd say, you know, there is no place in Canada where the people are closer in relationship to the people of the United States than wherever it is that we were standing. And I think that says a lot. It said a lot then. I think it says a lot now. And while there are problems from time to time, they're transitory, and that fundamentally there is a relationship between the Canadian people and the American people which will not be broken.
Well, David, I'm glad you made that point, because we have a tendency sometimes to personalize the relationship in the media. You know, I've referred to Mr. Obama, and I was complimentary. We've quoted Mr. Kennedy, and often, you know, Mr. Trump is in the news every day, and not always in a good way. But the relationship is much deeper than the people occupying, you know, the White House, or even 24 Sussex Drive, or the new building while this was being renovated. So I'm glad you raised it, and I'm going to take advantage of maybe asking you a specific question. You talked about talking to the president of the day, Mr. Obama, about you being in the best job in the U.S. government, and I've been to the marketplace where we have the Obama cookies that we can have, but he did come back and he did make a speech in the House of Commons. And that, to me, said a lot more than the first visit, because the first visit was very public relations oriented. And, you know, he was a very popular politician, even this side of the border. As you look at Mr. Obama, and I know you have a personal relationship with him, how did his view of Canada evolve from that first visit when you were ambassador to the last speech he made just a few months before he left office?
Well, he had been through 8 wearying years. You know, his hair turned gray, my hair fell out. We both went through a lot. But I think, in kind of going back to what I said a little bit earlier, he understood that, you know, maybe our interests don't coincide on every single issue. The one that came up with some frequency was the Keystone Pipeline. But in the scheme of things, those are small things. It may be important to an industry, it may be important to a region, but over the course of time, they are not the important things. And the one thing that I think never varied in his mind was the fact that the Canadians and Americans and the Canadian government and the American government share values. And that we are partners. We are not only partners at the border, we are partners around the world. And I cannot tell you how many times I went to the Canadian government to ask for something that was important to us, how many times the Canadian government came to me asking for something that was important to them. And oftentimes we just did it because a friend was asking. And again, I remember when President Obama spoke to the Parliament just soon before he left, and it was really quite a love fest. And one of the things he said was that, and I think this is evidence of where his head was, he said that the world needs more Canada, that NATO needs more Canada, and that we need more of you. And I think that says a lot about what he was thinking about. And again, it gets strained from time to time. And, you know, President Obama had an 80% approval rating in Canada. President Trump has a 20% approval rating in Canada. You know, we'll talk, I'm sure, about what's likely to happen on November 3rd. And maybe it'll get better, maybe it'll get worse. But I think over the course of time, we share values, and that transcends everything.
Well, it gives me the opportunity to ask my friend Ambassador Chrétien Raymond. You, of course, were ambassador at a time when negotiations were finalized on NAFTA. It had been largely negotiated under the Mulroney-Bush years, but it was there were modifications that the new Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien, wanted to have done, and Mr. Clinton was open to it. And finally, it got done. And but you're the kind of diplomat that doesn't just talk to one side; you talk to both sides. You're very well connected to the Senate, to Congress, and now we know you're playing an important role. Whether it's softwood lumber, or whether you're advising a Quebec government, or you're advising the Canadian government, you're still a player. How would you, without getting into personalities as such? You're still in the mix, in my view. You're still relevant, and you're still in the mix. You're not just a former ambassador. You're just doing things differently. How does it change? How has it changed? And for the people who are on this call, business people, business associations, chambres de commerce, boards of trade, what advice would you give them in conducting U.S.-Canadian economic relationships today as opposed to the 1990s?
Listen, John, good question. I will try to be brief. I arrived in Washington slightly more than 25 years ago, I guess 1994. I stayed there until the year 2000, Clinton year. The economy was booming on both sides of the border. Our exports then were 87% going to the US, 13% to the other 195 countries of the world. Good chemistry at the top, good, very good positive atmosphere. I was given an incredible access to the White House. And that made my life easier. Though, again, during my time, we had some serious issues, whether it was Pacific salmon, whether it was the threat of attacks to Canadians at the border. The referendum in 1995 was a very difficult issue to handle. It came to the heart of our nation, and to play it correctly with our American friends and neighbors was not an easy task. So it's different times. Of course, when I came into Washington, the NAFTA had just come into effect. So it was a period of adaptation, implementation. The big change I witnessed in the first year of my time in Washington was suddenly the arrival of Mexico on the scene. We had a very privileged bilateral relationship, but because of the first NAFTA, the Mexicans were suddenly everywhere. Whenever I would go to Congress, either the Senate or the House, I would have the Mexican ambassador next to me, quite often requesting the same favor. So it became more difficult. And Mexico has become, in my view, a country with an extraordinary access as well to Washington. So this was then. Today, my advice to the government would be, listen, you have done a great job for the negotiation of the USMCA. You had in place a strategy dealing with governors, dealing with the US trade associations, dealing with senators, congressmen, using premiers, using senior businessmen to reach our objectives. So that was good. That was brilliantly done by Prime Minister Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland. But now it's a different time. This is over. We have to wait and see what will happen in a few months and decide if we want to change our approach slightly differently, because the emphasis might not be just on trade in the years to come. It might be on big security issues, all kinds of huge issues facing the new administration, whether it's the Iranian Accord on nuclear proliferation, whether it's the future of NATO, whether it's the future of the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization. Canada will have to adjust her game to take into account this new challenge. So that's because I find that not enough, perhaps, ministers other than the key ministers involved in the trade relationship were going to Washington. We'll have to go back to the usual scenario where all ministers of the crown, they all have an axe to grind, they all have the issues in the US, they should all come one after the other. It's controlled by our ambassador in Washington. So to make sure that this very complex, broadly encompassing relationship is defended by all our ministers and all key players in that relationship. You know, David, I love my time in Washington, mais j'ai appris une chose. I learned one thing. Les Américains, on dit en français, les Américains ne nous font jamais de cadeaux. You have to fight in Washington all the time. We're only 36 million versus 250 million people. So there's a big job ahead for Canada now.
Raymond, I always say these days that I only go to Washington when I need my blood pressure elevated a little bit. So I understand the fighting part.
That's a good point, because when I was representing Quebec in New York, I remember a person told me about dealing with the Americans. Don't spend much time on the small talk. Get to the point quite early, quite quickly. So we didn't talk about the NFL Sunday games. We got straight to the point.
Ambassador Dewar and I used to talk about the NFL all the time.
Yeah. Well, Gary and you, I know both of you, I can understand it. That I'm not surprised, but that's beyond diplomacy. Je pense que Raymond, tu as bien mentionné le fait qu'aujourd'hui, c'est quasiment une diplomatie commerciale en permanence. I just said in French, David, and I want your comments on that. Essentially, the way Raymond's described it is practically pushing for permanent commercial and trade diplomacy. Would you advise that to the people who are dealing in the United States, whether they're associations or whether they're business people, that essentially you cannot just wait for big moments when there's a trade deal that has to be done. You got to do it literally every time and at different levels. In other words, permanent diplomacy. What's your take on that?
John, you know, the three of us were all diplomats at one point in our lives. And if there's one thing that I learned, not only as a diplomat, but as a lawyer, now as a banker, and throughout my whole life, you never want to go see somebody when their hair's on fire and have to introduce yourself. It's just not the way to do it. That one of the things that is very, very important is to have relationships of trust and confidence. And I think what you're talking about, whether you call it permanent diplomacy or anything else, is making sure that there are multiple lines of communication that are open and that there are relationships of trust and confidence. And it is not only between the president and the prime minister or between cabinet ministers in the two countries. It is between premiers and governors. It is between business people on both sides of the border. It is between NGOs on both sides of the border. It is to establish those relationships of trust and confidence, you know, even when there are hard issues that have to be dealt with. There are an awful lot of other things that can be dealt with. And so deal with those. Yeah, you talk about the hard stuff, you deal with them, but talk also about some of the things where you can make progress. And I think that's the way that you move the ball forward.
Well, in some ways, the softwood conflict, along with Mr. Trump reinitiating, or at least threatening to leave NAFTA, created a new dynamic, which I think both of you support now, which is continual conversations, continual pedagogy, continual contact. And I applaud that. But now I'm going to come to something a little bit more contentious, and I'm going to ask Raymond to comment on two things. Number one, to comment on the decision by the American government to impose tariffs on aluminum and steel, just on aluminum, that was brought in just about a month ago. We had them about a year ago. They were 2 years ago. Then they were dropped a year ago. Then you get a deal. Deal comes into application on July 1st, and less than a month later, we still have tariffs to deal with. So I'd like to have your take on that and see what can be done or what to anticipate in the short term. And the second one is a matter that you were very, very involved with was softwood lumber, and the fact that the WTO rendered a very positive decision that favored Canada. But we all know that the Trump administration is actually boycotting naming participants in the WTO process. So how do we deal with these are two issues that go to the heart of Canadian and Quebec, in some cases specifically Quebec industries. What's your advice and what's your take?
Avec plaisir, John. But before I go into lumber, aluminum, just a few words, two anecdotes about my time in Washington. David used a few. When I think of those almost 7 years, it was such a good relationship with President Clinton that everywhere I would go, everywhere I would meet him in the U.S., not only in Washington, but in any of the 50 states, he would shout at me, Raymond, Raymond. And then one day I said, how come you remember my name? We're 195 ambassadors in Washington. And I remember, he said, my favorite uncle's name was Raymond. So I'll never forget your name until my death. So that's good. But one issue that shows you how close it was then. One day, I love to make speeches. So I prepared one entitled, Mr. President, some advice from a friend and neighbor. So I remember I worked with John Higginbotham and Doug Waddell for weeks on this touchy subject, but it was a bit pretentious. Some advice from a friend and neighbor. So towards the time of the event, my colleagues were so nervous. They said, Raymond, you cannot say this. They'll throw you out. I said, listen, let's check. I mean, discreetly. So I phoned Mac McCarthy, who was the chief of staff of President Clinton. He said, Raymond, how much time do you have? I said, I'm going to make that speech in 48 hours. So I need you're taking, whether or not it's acceptable to go that far. He said, I'll go back to you in 24 hours. He came back to me 24 hours later. He said, Raymond, it's okay. I said, Mac, are you sure? He said, yes, I showed your speech to President Clinton. He approved. We'll give it. So I gave it to you. So it was very satisfying for a diplomat to know that it was not too risky. Now, aluminum and lumber. Again, very difficult, very touchy subjects. Just the ink is not even dry. And a couple of weeks ago, new tariffs have been imposed on our aluminum industry, 10%. This is 30,000 jobs in Quebec, 7,000 in pure aluminum involved in this industry. And suddenly they're using an article 232 of the Trade Expansion Act invoking national security to prevent our export or without to go to the U.S. It's almost insulting. Who believes that Canada is a threat to the national security of the U.S.? But again, it's managed trade. Quand ça fait l'affaire, ils respectent les ententes. Quand ça fait pas l'affaire, they impose tariffs. So we're fighting those tariffs very hard. I don't know if we'll be able to succeed before the end of this year. But the aluminum industry of Canada and the Quebec government are still fighting very hard to remove those tariffs. Now, lumber is a never-ending issue. I've been involved with lumber since my time in Washington. This decision last week is very important for Quebec. Suddenly, the World Trade Organization has decided that the Quebec forestry regime does not constitute a subvention to the industry. That the mechanism by which the prices are fixed on Quebec lands is the right price, and there's no problem with this. So this is it's a decision that was not well received in Washington. Mr. Lighthizer has already said, listen, again, I'm not going to abide by this. It's a proof that we're discriminated against. So will it remain lettre morte? He has not decided to appeal that decision yet, but it's going to be certainly a great moral, it is a moral victory. It'll be used constantly by Quebec in the negotiations to come to demonstrate that our lumber is not subsidized and that those tariffs, 20%, should disappear. They're $800 million stuck at the border right now, $3 billion for Canada. We need that money back, and we need those tariffs to disappear. But it's a very, very complicated issue. That's why it was not incorporated in the USMCA negotiations. It could have polluted the atmosphere too much.
Well, I would like to ask one, before we start talking about the election campaign, because I'm sure a lot of people are wanting to hear your respective takes on that campaign. I'd like to ask one more question on the relationship and maybe actually ask for a comment from both of you. The USMCA was signed and it's an application. We saw, of course, as we just talked about, the aluminum sideshow of the last month. But the fact of the matter is that at the outset, Mr. Trump said the NAFTA deal was the worst deal. It was a disaster. Those were the expressions. And people like Bernie Sanders on the other side were saying very similar things. Now he comes in and we have the USMCA and he's going to be making it one of his achievements in this election campaign. So I would like to get the take of two ambassadors, one on one side of the border, the other one on the other side of the border. what's the real story about USMCA? Is it a positive? Is it a negative? Did Canada lose out? Is it suddenly no longer a disaster, or is that just a lot of political hyperbole? So maybe we'll start with my American friend, David, to give us your take on USMCA. And I know I've had conversations with my friend Raymond, and I'd like you to give us your take publicly this time on that. So David, you go first.
My overwhelming reaction to the USMCA is that both sides dodged a bullet. That the alternative of somehow or another the ability to move goods and services and to a lesser extent people back and forth freely across the border was at risk. And if that fell apart, it was bad news for everybody. Okay, so we dodged a bullet. In terms of, was NAFTA the worst agreement in the history of the world and the USMCA the best agreement in the history of the world? No, because they're very, very, very similar. Is it good? Yeah, it's good. Not only is it good because we dodged a bullet, but it's probably better. There are things that were addressed in the USMCA that didn't even exist when NAFTA was negotiated. So it's a step in the right direction. But what concerned me the most about it was the opportunity cost. That we had an opportunity, probably not with this administration, but we had an opportunity between the United States and Canada and Mexico to negotiate the most progressive, most forward-leaning trade agreement anywhere in the world that would serve as a model for other agreements, and we didn't do that. And so, yeah, we dodged a bullet. It's probably a step in the right direction, but we could have done better. That's my reaction.
Raymond?
Again, I remember the first NAFTA, and during my time in Washington, I was always surprised to see how a lot of politicians there didn't like NAFTA, not on both sides of the equation, Republicans and Democrats. And after having watched it into effect for a number of years, I came to the conclusion that we Canadians have been extremely skillful in getting an awful lot of our requests accepted by the U.S. administration. So therefore, when President Trump said, listen, they have abused us, they have got far more than they should deserve, etc., there is a bit of truth in that. Because, I mean, the first NAFTA, we did very, very well. Now, this new USMCA, we did equally well, but it was not easy. We had to make some compromises. It's a very important one on supply management is one. But other, I mean, the dispute settlement mechanism has been kept in place, hugely important for us Canadians, because we resolve our disputes through the NAFTA panels, etc. So I would say I'm glad to see the new USMCA in place. What I don't like is the fact it doesn't seem to mean much when hard American interests are at stake. I mean, it's good for the USMCA, but if it's not respected, then what's it for? So we're there now. We'll have to, first of all, it's coming into effect fully only at the end of this month. We'll have to watch the next 6-12 months how it's going to go. But thank God, at least we have resolved this economic uncertainty. But let me tell you, we were drawn by force to the table. Mexico and Canada, we didn't like to go back to this table. So there it was, and let's see the next 6 to 12 months what the net effects will be.
Well, thank you both for that, and I think it's my take from what I hear is encouraging, and you're right about the dispute resolution mechanism was kept, and I also think the renewal aspect is important. There's going to be renewal, and then once the renewal or reevaluation of after a certain number of years, and then it goes on for a number of years. So I don't think we'll be open to the same kind of threats. We're out in 6 months or we're out in 9 months. So I think this is good, and that brings me to the election campaign. We've had now 2 weeks of conventions. I would say one was completely virtual, the other one was semi-virtual. And of course, the poll numbers are starting to come out, and we are seeing them in some cases. I'll let you guys comment on that. But as we look, we're really 2 months away from the election day. We know that we're in the middle of a pandemic. We know that we're in the middle of an important economic recession, one of the most important in decades. And we know that there's racial tensions like I haven't seen them for a long time. And I'm a product of the 60s, of Martin Luther King years. And I went to the United States as a student to see firsthand what happened to some cities. And now I'm seeing a repetition of that on my screen at night. So I'd like to get essentially, I'll start with David. We're essentially two months away. How do you see the election campaign evolving over the next 6 to 8 weeks?
Well, let me begin by saying that I'm surprised that anyone asks me what's likely to happen in our election after I spent most of 2016 running around telling anybody who'd listen that Hillary was going to be the next president of the United States. But you asked, so I'll answer. Look, first of all, you're right. There have been a number of polls, particularly over the last couple of days after the conventions, that doesn't seem to be very much movement in those polls. The electorate in the United States is very divided, and it is very locked in. There aren't a lot of truly undecided voters. You know, whatever somebody says to a pollster, the fact of the matter is people kind of know the direction they're going. If you go up to somebody and say, you know, who do you like, Biden or Trump? And they say, oh, gee, I just don't know. Chances are that is the lowest of low information voters and not likely to vote. But, you know, I think things are fairly locked in. The guru of predicting, although he made the same mistake I made in 2016, but the guru of predicting is a guy named Nate Silver at 538. Some of you probably go there regularly. He came out, I guess, 2 weeks ago with his election model. I checked this morning, and he gives Biden a 69% chance of winning. One of the things that you have to understand is, what does that mean? It does not mean Biden is going to win. It means that if there were 100 elections, Biden would win 69 of them and Trump would win 31 of them. So this thing is by no means over. Someone once wisely said that a week in politics is an eternity. We got 9 weeks. That's 9 eternities. A lot can happen. But it does seem pretty locked in. And unless there's something, you know, some kind of exogenous shock, some real surprise, some terrible performance at the debate, something like that, yeah, I don't think there's going to be a whole heck of a lot of movement. But my biggest caveat is we have 9 weeks to go. And if we had this call again 3 or 4 weeks from now, when things really do start to settle and hard to unsettle, if everything looks the same as it does now, I think that's good news for Joe Biden.
Well, I think for our participants, always keep in mind, popular vote is one thing, but you become president if you win the Electoral College. I think it's fair to say that probably Mr. Biden's definitely going to win the popular vote. As Mrs. Clinton won. Ms. Clinton won last time, but she lost the Electoral College. So that's what we have to observe.
We do not have a national election. We have 50 state elections, and there are 6 or 7 of those states that take on overwhelmingly more importance because they're close.
I would like to add something, John.
Yeah, but I'll let you add to something, but I'll also throw you a question, because you were one who lived through 2 administrations of a president. You lived through Mr. Clinton 1, and you lived through Clinton 2. What should we expect if we have Trump 2? And could it be different? And secondly, how do you see a Biden administration?
Listen, first, I defer to David about the electoral process in the U.S. He follows it far more closely and is much better placed to comment on it than I am. But I would like to remind our audience that it's very, very difficult to defeat an incumbent president. In the history of the U.S., I think there are only 4 presidents who have not been given a second mandate. So that's always a pause, a concern. So now about your, that's a difficult answer. Trump or Biden presidency, I guess if President were to be reelected, at least we know what it has been over the last 4 years. In terms of his priorities, he has been quite silent in this campaign so far. He has not revealed much about what he would like to accomplish. We know he's a protectionist president, so we have to expect more, far more of that because of the economic situation in the U.S. 40 million people without jobs, an economy in recession. He might wish to kickstart the American economy by launching a huge infrastructure program, as he wanted to do after his tax cut victory in Congress. So that will have to be watched very carefully by Canadians, because if he were to proceed on that track, that might mean opportunities for our construction companies here in Quebec or in Canada. But having said this, I expect Buy America, Buy America, Buy America stronger than before, because of what they will have to need to rectify or to correct their own economy. On the foreign policy front for Trump, we know there's no vision d'ensemble. It's more ad hoc. He goes à coup, as we say in French. We know he wants to disengage the U.S. from Afghanistan, from the Middle East. The Americans don't need as much oil as before from outside. He has already weakened what I call the infrastructure put into place after 1945 for the prosperity and security of the world. So probably more of the same. Now, President Biden, listen, from his time in the Senate, from his time as vice president, he knows Canada quite well. He has as his codicien Madame Kamala Harris, who has been raised a little bit, spent some time here in Montreal. That might be a plus for us. But he will be as protectionist, maybe more so than President Trump. Remember, historically, Democrats have been more protectionist. Republicans have been more for free trade and free access to goods and services. But there's no such thing at the moment. There's no such dichotomy at the moment. So with Biden, I would expect a lot of Buy America. The greatest threat to our economy is these Buy America provisions. But Biden also has created a big uncertainty in Alberta. He has said, Keystone XL, I'm against that. This is a huge issue for Alberta, a huge issue for Canada. So it's a kind of, is it a trade issue, an economic issue? It's more environmental issue. And our problem is with the courts in the US. But if he were to maintain that line, if we cannot convince him to change his tune on this, that would be a big problem for Canada. Internationally, I expect a Biden presidency to reach out to the more traditional allies of the US, Japan, Canada, Europeans, Korea, and not restrict their attitude towards Erdogan, towards Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel or Putin in Russia, and a few others, Bolsonaro in Brazil. So it will be more traditional, going back to the traditional allies of the US.
Bien, je pense, je peux juste résumer rapidement, je pense que pour nos participants, parce que je veux poser une dernière question sur la Chine, il est clair que c'est une élection qui va avoir des répercussions canadiennes, peu importe qui sera choisi. Dans le cas de Trump, c'est un gars imprévisible, mais on peut s'attendre que ça ne changera pas. Et dans le cas de Biden, il ne faut jamais oublier qu'il y a toujours eu un courant protectionniste dans le Parti démocrate. Et il ne faut jamais oublier que s'il gagne, il va être un peu redevable à Bernie Sanders en soi. So I think your answers, both of you, have indicated that no matter who wins, this is going to be an election that will have direct impact on Canada-US relations. The Buy America thing will come, obviously, as an important ingredient in post-COVID economy. And I think it's important because we have had a tendency to look at elections in the United States more like a show. I mean, I spoke about Obama earlier. I mean, we were all inspired when Obama won. We go back to the Kennedys, another generation for the baby boomers who remember, we all fell in love with the Democrats because we fell in love with the Kennedys. Unfortunately, it took the assassination of them to become essentially folk heroes. But the fact of the matter is that we were watching it more like a spectacle. This one will have more direct impact on people listening on this conference call today, on this Zoom call, because it will have an impact directly on economic choices, and we have to be ready for that. And that brings me to the final question.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because I think it's important. Obviously, there will be direct impacts on whether it's Buy America or the border or whatever. But there's a more important impact that Canada does well when the United States does well, and vice versa. And I think the thing that is the most on the ballot in this country, and I'm not here to make a campaign pitch for one side or the other. You could probably all guess which side I'd make that pitch for. But the issue that's on the ballot is there's a real choice about the direction that this country should take. And who's going to be the person that does a better job of getting COVID under control? Who is going to be the person who does a better job of rebuilding our economy, which is critical to the economy in Canada? Who is going to be the person who deals with racial injustice in a way that gets things back to normal, and not even normal, that improves the situation in that regard? And to me, those are the issues that are going to have a bigger impact on Canada than Buy America or any other bilateral thing that is likely to come up.
Well, thank you very much. Time is running out. We're about on time, so I'm going to cheat a little bit with my friend Charles by asking both of you in 60 seconds or less, each of you, to see how the relationship between our countries vis-a-vis China. As we know, Wang Chou was arrested because of the extradition treaty we have between Canada and the United States. We also know that the two Michaels are still in prison, facing certainly not liberation in the short term. So the relationship between Canada and China is not close, far from it, probably cooler than ever. And yet we were the first to recognize, back then called it Red China, and China got into the to the Security Council because Canada was first, but America was shortly afterwards under President Nixon. So the United States, for until last January, seemed to be having sort of like a love affair with President Xi, but now even Trump said that he was managing the Wuhan issue in a good way in January. And now it's basically a debate between who's going to be soft on China, who's going to be hard on China. So could you give me your sense of where that relationship is going to be in the next year or two from an American perspective and from a Canadian perspective? 60 minutes each. Raymond Chrétien, you go first. 60 seconds each.
I would need five minutes. Listen, very, very quickly. This request by the US has thrown a wrench in that key relationship for Canada. China is our second most important trading partner. It has created a lot of nervousness and uncertainty in Ottawa about what to do. It's very, very difficult for our government in Ottawa to conceive a coherent strategy towards China when you take into account the detention of the two Michaels. Michael Spavor, Michael Cornet, and at the time also when old issues like their treatment of human rights, the Uyghurs, especially now, the fact that China is not respected the joint British-China declaration on the rendition of Hong Kong to China, a huge issue. I mean, there are 300,000 people in Hong Kong who could come to Canada in the next months or so. So this is an issue that will be with us for, I'm afraid, years to come. And it's a very difficult issue for our government to handle right now.
David.
I believe that regardless of who wins the election, that we are, in terms of the US-China relationship, it is not likely to get better, and it's probably likely to get worse. There'll be a difference in tone. Clearly, Joe Biden is not going to say some of the things that Donald Trump would say. But I think that there is a consensus in my country that we need to be more firm, tougher in our dealings with China. And my guess is that while there may be ebbs and flows in the relationship between what Canada and the United States do vis-a-vis China, that fundamentally they'll be moving in the same direction. So I don't view the situation as getting better for either of us.
Well, thank you both. Thank you very much. I'll have maybe a closing word a little later because now it's the participants, but the man who's going to lead that is the man who leads the FCCQ, notre leader, Charles, pour la période de questions, pour les gens qui sont sur Zoom. Et j'aurai un petit mot de la fin pour remercier nos deux participants. Charles, je cède la parole.
Merci beaucoup, John. Thank you to the three of you for this very interesting discussion. Ceux qui participent aux événements COREX, vous aurez reconnu aussi évidemment Claude Gagnon, qui est président BMO Groupe Financier Québec, donc qui est le partenaire, le présentateur de la série. Claude est aussi un collègue de travail de M. Jacobson, donc à la fois au Québec et aux États-Unis. Alors, merci beaucoup d'être avec nous, Claude, et on te laissera le mot de la fin tout à l'heure. Il nous reste très peu de temps, mais je profite de l'occasion aussi pour vous mentionner un peu le footprint de la FCCQ dans les relations Canada-États-Unis. On a une excellente relation avec l'équipe des délégués généraux du Québec, l'équipe d'ailleurs parmi lesquelles John a contribué dans les dernières années à New York. Je vois aussi dans la liste des participants Mme Catherine Loubier, qui est la déléguée en ce moment à New York, donc je salue, avec qui on a une excellente relation. On parle aussi beaucoup avec la North Country Chamber of Commerce, donc qui s'occupe beaucoup de tout ce qui se passe au niveau upstate New York. On organise des tables rondes. Tout ça pour vous dire que ça nous fait plaisir d'être une porte d'entrée vers vous dans le commerce avec les États-Unis à travers les différentes initiatives de COREX. We have a few questions live, but I want to ask something to Mr. Jacobson, and maybe Mr. Chrétien can comment as well. How do you see the contribution of Mrs. Kamala Harris to the Democratic ticket? Like, how is it perceived in the U.S.? And another quick question: if the polls are right, and Mr. Biden is going probably maybe towards a victory, which swing state will be his biggest challenge, according to you?
Well, first of all, I think that the Kamala pick has been certainly very well received by potential Democratic voters. I think the fact that President or Vice President Biden raised $365 million in August, much of it coming from the day that Kamala was picked, is evidence of that. There are other reasons, the convention and other things, but I think it's very well received. I think it was a very smart pick, and I think it will help. In terms of the swing states that are, there are a number of swing states. The ones that are probably the most difficult for both sides, by definition, they're swing states. Pennsylvania is very close, North Carolina is very close, Florida is very close. I think that if I were a Canadian watching television on November 3rd, the thing I would watch is Florida. Because if Trump loses Florida, and Florida has had a lot of other problems, but one of the things they do is they count their ballots fast, including mail-in ballots, and because they start tabulating them as they come in. And so if Trump loses Florida, it's just and so that's the one I would pay attention to. As Tim Russert quite famously said in an election night in 2000, it's Florida, Florida, Florida.
Any comments, Mr. Chrétien?
Very briefly, I defer to David because he knows the situation far more than I do, but a comment on Kamala Harris. We Canadians, when we watch the American political scene, we're always looking for friends, allies, people who know us, have lived here. So with Kamala Harris, really, there is a person who's been raised in Montreal here for years, knows Quebec, knows Canada. Hopefully, she will have a lot of affinities with us. So that is certainly a plus for. But again, it's who knows what will happen the 3rd of November. We're far, far away. I'm looking for the debates first to see how it's going to go. The next big step will be the debates.
Yep. All right. Thank you. From what I heard, she didn't have such a great time in Montreal. I don't know how such a thing is possible, but hopefully she'll remember.
That I can't speak to, but if you were looking for a potential vice presidential candidate who knew a lot and was very fond of Canada, you probably would have been voting for Susan Rice. Her husband is Canadian, and they come to Canada all the time, and she is, I can vouch for the fact, she is quite fond of Canada.
All right. Alors, on va passer à Monsieur Michael Novak. Alors, Michael, on t'écoute.
Hi, everybody. Bonjour, Raymond. Hi, John. Hi, Claude. And hi, David. Very, very quickly, I was chair of the FCCQ, as you know, for a couple of years. And in that role, I went down, sort of pre-negotiation of the current NAFTA. I went down to Washington, met with members of Congress, both on the Republican and on the Democrat side. And the subject of Buy America came up many, many times. And my take on it, which got a lot of traction, I think, on both sides of the House, was Buy North America. And what I meant by that was that if you're, no matter where you are in North America, if you have access to the very best and the most valued, whether it's components or services, anywhere across any border, and you're able to incorporate that into your own offering, we all become much more competitive against the rest of the world. And that's why I always called it Buy North America, not Buy America. And we were supported in that by the North Country Chamber of Commerce, as Charles mentioned, by the US Chamber. And it really got a lot of traction. I think as business people, when we go down there, we got to keep repeating that message. Buy North America, together we are stronger. And I love what Gary Douglas, who is still very involved with the North Country Chamber, his main thing was, let us not define our regions by our borders. Because as a region that works together, we're much stronger against the rest of the world, whether it's against Asia or anywhere else. That's the way. And I think aluminum is a great example of that. Aluminum is less costly when you get it out of Quebec. It's greener. And Google and Apple recognize that because now they want to incorporate Quebec aluminum to all their products because they're just a lot more competitive than the rest of the world. So that's my contribution. And thank you. It's been a great session. Thanks very much. Bye.
All right. Merci, merci beaucoup, Michael. J'ai une autre question rapidement ici. Donc, Sonia Ziadé. Sonia, est-ce que tu m'entends?
Sonia is mute.
Sonia's muted.
Yeah, Sonia is muted.
Sorry,
Voilà.
guys, I got disconnected. So
All
nice
right.
to see all of you. Thank you for allowing me to say something. I had a quick question. I didn't want to take anyone's time because I don't know how many questions there are, but I've been thinking about this a lot. And I don't know if there's still time to mail in our ballots from abroad, and I say ours. I don't have, unfortunately, the right to vote, but there are 600,000 American citizens in Canada. Only, as you know, 5% of them voted in 2016. All the issues that you've talked about have an impact on our economy. How can we convince our American friends in Canada to go vote, because it has a big impact on our daily lives, whether we realize it or not? And if there's still time, can you help us build a campaign? I don't know, like the margins are so narrow in some states, it could maybe tip the vote. So I would like to maybe have a strategy from you on how we can have our neighbors here around us send their ballot.
The answer, my successor, Bruce Heyman, who I think some of you know, he and his wife have been extremely active in, not just between the United States and Canada, but globally, in getting Americans abroad, American citizens who live somewhere else, to vote. And they're all entitled. If you're an American citizen, you're entitled to vote. Your vote is counted in the last state that you lived in, And if you have never lived in a state, the state your parents lived in. It is, you request a ballot online. I don't have the URL handy, but if anyone is interested, just Google it. And there's a place where you request the ballot. It comes to you. There is still plenty of time to do it. It has to be received by November 3rd by law. It doesn't matter what the state's law is. This is controlled by federal law. It has to be received by November 3rd. So leave aside who people are going to vote for. If any of you, this is, as we've talked about, this is an extremely consequential election. And if any of you know, and I'm sure many of you do, know American citizens who are therefore eligible to vote, get them to request a ballot and get them to fill it out and get it back. Because you're right, historically, a very small number of people, American citizens in Canada and around the world, actually vote.
Right. Thank you. Merci, Sonia. So we're almost out of time. So I'm going to ask John maybe for a few closing words, and then we'll hand it over to Claude for the final word.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. Reconnecting with my friend Raymond and David is extremely heartwarming. There's an issue I didn't raise, and I don't want it to be obviously a discussion now because we're at the end. It's the importance of the Senate. The Senate is at play as well in this campaign, not just the presidency. So that probably, as we say en français, matière pour une autre réunion. But the Senate is, whoever controls the Senate, if it's Trump with the Democratic Senate, he's handicapped a lot on the things he's going to do. And if it's Biden with a Republican Senate, he faces something very similar. I'd like to thank, again, FCCQ, but especially my dear friend, David. David, you make us feel good about the relationship, and you really bring us down to the people dimension, not just to the institutional dimension and to the discord, sometimes the conflicts that dominate the news. So thank you very much for taking the time. And the same thing to my dear friend Raymond. Raymond, you are a person who is a walking fountain of knowledge on Canada-US relations. I'm glad we can count. And I will leave you the last word, but I want to just look at my friend Claude Gagnon. Claude Gagnon, I'm happy to say that he is doing a great job. Michael Novak was a tough act to follow, but I just wanted to say hi to him because Claude and I, when we were out of COVID confinement, we see each other quite regularly, and now I just noticed that his hair's got longer. But Raymond and I are wearing a tie today. So this is the first time I've done this since March, and I did it for my friend David, but David said, look, don't ask me too much. I've got the jacket on. Don't ask me for the tie.
I forgot how to tie it.
At all.
1 minute. I guess to conclude, maybe David also should be given his time to. My view of the relationship and the relationship between Americans and the Canadians is the following. First of all, Canadians are North Americans. I feel that we understand each other much better perhaps than Europeans or the Asiatic people understand the US. So we have this kind of natural connection. Over the decades, we have always had issues to sort out, difficult issues sometimes, war and peace issues. At the time of Vietnam, we had to disagree. At the time of the invasion of Iraq, we had to disagree, but we work out our problems. This is the beauty of that relationship. My second point is the following. I keep listening to American politicians referring to the US as the greatest country in the world. I don't disagree with that. But to that affirmation, I used to say when I was in Washington, you might be the greatest, but we're the best. So take your time. Decide which one is better. But ultimately, Canadians, it's a win-win situation for both. We're lucky to be living next to the richest, most powerful country in the world. Our standard of living, our quality of life depend upon that relationship, depend upon our exports to the US. And on the other side, the Americans are lucky to have at their northern border a peaceful country, a very rich country, a very socially advanced country, quite often un laboratoire pour eux. I think it's ultimately a win-win situation for both the US and Canada. I will not say another word, John.
Just real quickly, first of all, I don't disagree with anything that Ramon said. Second of all, in one sentence to John's Senate question, I believe it will flip and the Democrats will control it. And third of all, and most importantly, I hope it's come through in this conversation and many others that I've had over the years. I loved my time in Canada. I miss you all. Can't wait till the borders open so we can come visit.
Claude?
See, Charles. First, let me thank you, gentlemen, Mr. Jacobson, David, my colleague in Chicago, Monsieur Chrétien, John, for the great job that you've done as usual, as coordinating this, I wouldn't say a debate, but this conversation between our good friends. And I just want to remember to remind to everyone on this call that BMO was founded over 200 years ago here in Montreal, and one of the first branch that we opened was in New York, so south of the border. And the main objective of the Bank of Montreal was to make sure that there was facilitate trade on both sides of the border. So and we're still working on it on a daily basis. We have important businesses south of the border where David is sitting right now. And on a daily basis, our people on both sides of the borders are making it, I would say, seamless, totally transparent to make sure that we keep good relations and that we make sure that everything is possible for our two economies. So, David, again, thank you very much. Monsieur Chrétien, merci beaucoup. Merci à tout le monde d'avoir été là. Et Charles, et encore une fois, John, excellent travail. Donc, à la prochaine.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup, Claude. Merci, Bémo. Merci à nos trois panélistes. Thank you very much. On aura beaucoup d'autres événements donc au cours de l'automne avec le programme COREX et ça nous fera plaisir de vous revoir très bientôt. D'ici là, vous voyez que certains d'entre nous sommes au centre-ville, alors on vous invite, un peu comme la mairesse et le gouvernement, à réinvestir nos centres-villes. It's very nice downtown Montreal, so you all should come back and we hope to see you. All right. Merci. Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye. Merci.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.